All right. Well, hi everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here at this presentation of Naturalist Journeys from North Branch Nature Center. I'm going to kick us off here first by thanking the sponsors for this programming this year. Our lead sponsors, Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee, and all the other sponsors that you can see on your screen as well. Yeah, so you are part of a Naturalist Journeys presentation this evening. And I do want to mention that all of this year's presentations focus on climate change and climate change stories, though maybe not the traditional climate change stories that we often hear, so a different take on it. And I want to highlight our three remaining talks after this evening. We have Gus Goodwin from the Nature Conservancy's office in Vermont coming to talk about Vermont's 30 by 30 biodiversity conservation effort and how the Nature Conservancy is working to achieve that. Ali Kosiba from the University of Vermont is coming to talk about how forests store carbon, particularly in the soil. And our final presentation of this year is pianist Ben Cosgrove, who will be giving a piano presentation. Ben is a musician who composes instrumental pieces about landscape and is a regular artist in residence in national parks and other amazing places across North America. Let's see, for tonight, you're in a Zoom webinar. So I'm going to invite you, if you have questions for Ruth at the end, we'll have a question and answer period. You can use either the chat or the question and answer functions at the bottom of your screen for your questions. You may not be able to see each other's questions, just so you know. And I wanted to mention that if for whatever reason you have to step out or your tech doesn't work, all of our Naturalist Journeys talks are available just a couple days after they happen at our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. So you can find it there afterwards if you need to. Now I get to introduce our presenter for this evening, Ruth Heindel. Ruth is a professor of environmental studies at Kenyon College in Central Ohio, where she teaches courses on Earth system science, climate change, and environmental field methods. She uses ecology, geology, and geochemistry to answer questions about the impact of changing climate and land use on alpine and polar ecosystems. So we're so lucky to get to go along with her tonight to her field research sites in Greenland and Antarctica. And yes, in case you were wondering, Ruth is also my sister, so it's extra special to welcome her tonight. Okay, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Naomi, for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here this evening, and I am excited to share some science and some stories from Greenland and from Antarctica. Before I get into those locations, I want to tell you a little bit about my own kind of naturalist journey and how I got to be where I am today. So Naomi and I both grew up in Vermont, right? We spent a lot of time outside with our family growing up, and from a very early age, I really liked all kind of winter activities and extreme environments. And I got my first taste of kind of polar research during high school. In the upper left corner here, this is a photo of me in high school. I was fortunate enough to be a part of an Earthwatch expedition, and Earthwatch is an organization that pairs science projects with citizens who are eager to kind of get involved. And so I was up at the tree line in Churchill, Manitoba, and this was my first taste of polar science, and I got totally hooked. And for the next many years, I've been trying to kind of get back to these amazing polar landscapes just as much as I can. So in the middle panel, during college, I participated in the Juneau Icefield Research Program. So this is a program where I skied from Juneau, Alaska into British Columbia across the Juneau Icefield, and we collected glaciology measurements and learned about glacial geology along the way. In college as well, in the upper right corner, I studied abroad on Svalbard, the island archipelago that is between Norway and the North Pole. This is a photo of me seeing the sun for the first time in about 50 days, which was a pretty amazing experience. And then when I went on to graduate school, I went to Dartmouth to be part of an interdisciplinary program that focused on polar environmental change. And this was a really amazing program that brought us to Greenland. And so this photo of me in the lower left corner is doing my dissertation field research in Greenland. And that's the kind of where the Greenland part of this talk is going to come from my PhD research there. During graduate school, I was also fortunate enough to be able to do research in the McMurdo Dry Valleys in Antarctica. And so this last photo here on the bottom right is a photo of me and my PhD advisor, Ross, Virginia, in the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And so that will be kind of the other component of tonight's talk. After I graduated from Dartmouth, in 2017, I then went on to be a postdoc at the University of Colorado in Boulder. This was a research position where I was able to kind of continue on my Antarctica research. I went back to Antarctica again, but also was able to do some alpine research in the Colorado Front Range. There are a lot of overlaps between alpine and Arctic and Antarctic research. And so this was a good kind of way for me to do that alpine research and also to experience what it's like to do field research basically in your backyard rather than many continents away. And then currently I am an assistant professor of environmental studies at Kenyon College. Kenyon is a very small liberal arts school in central Ohio, just outside of Columbus. And the population at Kenyon is entirely undergraduate. And so the research that I do at Kenyon really is focused on mentoring and teaching undergraduates to be field scientists and to kind of prepare them for wherever they are headed next. And at Kenyon, my work has also kind of paired both polar science. I've continued to do Antarctica research with more local science. So here is a student who's setting up some precipitation collectors just outside of Columbus. My research, so that's a little bit about kind of where I've done a lot of research and the kind of journeys that I've gone on. My research itself focuses on kind of the dust cycle. And you all may be thinking, why on earth would you want to study dust? We just want to kind of get rid of dust in our daily lives, right? We sweep it away, we vacuum it up. But there's a lot, a really important role that dust plays in our Earth system. And this, you can kind of track dust from where it begins, where it is produced. There are natural causes, just natural wind erosion that can create dust, but also human activities that can contribute to dust as well, like agriculture, construction, anything that really disrupts the ground surface. Once dust is in the atmosphere, it can interact directly with our climate by interacting with solar radiation and also with cloud formation. Dust also has a big impact where it lands. And finally, it has an impact directly on humans when we breathe in these tiny particles. It can be very damaging to our lungs. It can also block our visibility. So I'm not going to get in a lot into the kind of details of the dust-related research that I have done, I'm just going to give you little kind of tidbits from Greenland and from Antarctica. But this, I wanted to kind of tell you, this is the angle that I kind of come at this question of climate change. I'm often thinking about kind of land use and wind, and how these things kind of interact with climate change. Okay, so now we're going to kind of take our first journey to Greenland. And this is a map of the island of Greenland. And as you can see, it is largely covered by the Greenland ice sheet. The vast majority of the island is covered by this ice sheet, and that might be kind of what comes to mind when you think of Greenland. But in fact, there is a lot of land around the margins of the ice sheet. And this land is really diverse ecosystem, and it is also a homeland to about 57,000 people. This is majority indigenous population of Inuit, and Greenland itself is known as Kalaalleq Nunaat in the indigenous language. And in terms of this kind of indigenous culture, Greenland is closely tied with the rest of North America. So this is a map from the Arctic Council. We're now looking down on the North Pole. Here is Greenland. It's maybe a different view of the world than you're used to seeing. But this is a map of all of the different Arctic language families. And what I want to point out here is that Greenland shares this blue color, which is this Inuit group, with Northern Canada and all the way across Northern Alaska. So in terms of the indigenous culture and indigenous language, Greenland is really part of North America and shares that heritage. However, because of the history of colonialism and the history of the Scandinavian groups coming over, colonizing Greenland and settling there, Greenland currently shares a lot of history and ties with Scandinavia as well. So it has this really interesting kind of mix of cultures. And I just want to show an example of, this is Nuuk, the capital city of Greenland. Nuuk has a population of about 20,000 people. For those of you living in Vermont, I think that's around the population of South Burlington, just to give you a sense. And you can see that the architecture here looks very Scandinavian. And so Nuuk shares a lot of, and the rest of Greenland also shares a lot of culture with Scandinavian countries. Greenland also, there's a lot of kind of interesting geopolitical topics that we could discuss today about Greenland, because it still shares ties in terms of military and financial ties with Denmark. It has achieved kind of a sense of independence and self-rule, but there is still a lot of fight in Greenland to try to become financially independent from Denmark. So that is kind of one aspect of Greenland that I want you to be aware of. But for the rest of today, I'm going to talk more about the climate change that is already impacting Greenland. And often I think when folks think about climate change in Greenland, probably think about melting ice and the implications that that has for sea level rise. And there's very good reason to be thinking about melting ice when you think about Greenland, because the Greenland ice sheet is an enormous volume of ice that has the capacity to raise sea level considerably. So here I am standing on the top of the Greenland ice sheet, and I'm standing here on 2 miles of ice. So it's kind of hard to fathom that, but if all of that ice melted, it would raise sea level by 7 meters. No one is thinking that that is going to happen anytime immediately, but there is the potential for Greenland to contribute a lot to sea level rise. And in fact, this has already started to occur. So this is a figure that I'm showing from the most recent IPCC assessment report. And what you're looking at here is the kind of amount of ice on Greenland from 1980 up until the present and then into the future. So this figure combines both observations, things we've already seen in the past, with then future kind of possible scenarios and projections into the future. So what this line is showing is that over time, we have already observed a decrease in the amount of ice that is on Greenland. And this has contributed already about 1 centimeter of sea level rise globally. And then when we look into the future, we can see that all of these, it's kind of like a fan of different lines that continue downward into the future. This fan is not just a single line because we don't know what the future holds, right? In terms of politics, in terms of our commitment to reducing greenhouse gases, in terms of global population, all of these things are unknown. And so we can come up with a range of different predictions or projections into the future. And all of those, the vast majority of those lines, right, are negative, trending downward. That indicates a loss of ice from Greenland, and that transfers into a rise in sea level. So this is a really important reason for us to care about warming in the Arctic. The Arctic has already experienced more warming than the rest of the globe, and it will likely continue to warm at a faster rate than the rest of the globe. But ice melt and sea level rise isn't the only reason that we should care about climate change in the Arctic. There are other reasons as well. And in order to kind of get into those, I'm going to zoom in and be a little bit more local now. And I want to tell you about the region of Kangerlussuaq here, which is in southwestern Greenland. And this is where I did my PhD research. So I'm going to introduce you to this location a bit, this landscape, and then tell you about a few ways that climate change has been impacting this landscape that might not immediately come to mind. So this is a landscape that is right on the margin of the ice sheet. So you can see the Greenland ice sheet in the distance. And then the landscape is a mixture of lakes and tundra, so very low-lying shrubs and grasses, and exposed rock and soil. One thing that is really unusual and unique about this landscape is that it's actually very dry. You can think of this as a polar desert, right? So we're actually looking at sand dunes here. And again, sand dunes might not be the first thing you think of when you think of Greenland. But this region is very dry, and the glacier is constantly eroding and producing all of this sediment. And so all of this sediment and material, this kind of finely ground up rock, gives us all the kind of raw material to form these sand dunes. This also tells us that wind plays a really important role in this landscape as well. This is a really beautiful place, and shares some similarities, at least in the flora, with some of the alpine regions that you all might be familiar with. If you go up to the summit of the White Mountains or Mount Mansfield, you're going to see some of the same alpine flowers. But in Greenland, you see just kind of like wide, amazing expanses of these flowers here. We're looking at some rhododendrons. This is also a landscape with some charismatic megafauna. We have caribou on the landscape, as well as musk oxen. These are probably my favorite animal on the tundra. They have this amazingly warm and soft fur, and they're just incredible creatures to see. There's also Arctic hare. These are very, like, almost enormous rabbits. They're very large, and can be kind of tricky to spot, but they're amazing as well. And one thing I want to point out about this landscape is that it is relatively young. What I mean by that is that during the last glacial maximum, so around 20,000 years ago, the Greenland ice sheet was much larger and it covered the entire island of Greenland. So none of that land that was kind of exposed on the margins actually was exposed. It was all under ice. And then as the climate warmed into our current kind of Holocene climate, the ice retreated and it came onto land around 10,000 years ago. And then around 7,000 years ago is when it retreated enough to expose this landscape that I'm showing you photos of. And in terms of kind of landscape development, 7,000 years is actually a pretty short period of time. And so in many ways, this landscape is one that is kind of still developing and has definitely experienced climate changes in the past. And this landscape is also one that is experiencing climate change right now. So this map kind of on the right, this inset that I'm showing here, is showing warming that Greenland has already experienced over the last 4 decades. And you can see that this region has already experienced multiple degrees Celsius of warming. And kind of Western Greenland especially has experienced a lot of warming. So climate change is definitely kind of already very evident here. And this has impacts on kind of all of the different components of the landscape, the vegetation, the wind, how the wind transports sediment, and of course, how the glacier melts. So I'm going to just tell you a few different ways that kind of I have seen climate change impact this landscape. The first one still has to do with melting ice. So as I mentioned, right, this landscape is right on the margin of the Greenland ice sheet. And what that means is that when the ice sheet melts, all of this water is then kind of transported across the landscape as it travels out to the ocean, right? Sometimes we think about ice melt and then immediately that translates into sea level rise, but that water actually has to make its way into the ocean. And my first field season in Greenland was in 2012, and this was a very unusual summer. So what we're looking at here is the percentage of the surface of Greenland, of the Greenland ice sheet, excuse me, that usually experiences melting conditions. So this blue dashed line is the average. And what you can see is that kind of the peak of summer in July, about 25% of the surface of the Greenland ice sheet is experiencing melting conditions. Usually that picture that I showed of myself standing on the summit of Greenland, that usually never experiences melt. It is always below freezing up there. It's very cold and dry. However, in 2012, there were these really extreme conditions that led to almost 100% of the Greenland ice sheet experiencing melting conditions. So this doesn't mean that 100% of the ice sheet melted, right? It just means that along the surface, about 100% of the surface experienced some time when temperatures were above freezing and some melting occurred. And this generated an enormous amount of meltwater that then kind of made its way off of the ice sheet and traveled across these kind of marginal landscapes into the ocean. And this is what it looked like in Kangerlussuaq, with this just incredible amount of water coming out of the river and heading out into the ocean. And the bridge actually that you're seeing, this wasn't even the height of the amount of water that came out. This bridge was washed out, which then ended up kind of disconnecting some of the town from each other. And there were some communication issues with kind of the important communication lines going across the river. So this was a really big event for this community. They did eventually rebuild this bridge, I think actually at the same height that it was before. But these are the kind of direct impacts that ice melt can have on the communities right on the margin of the ice sheet in Greenland. As many of you unfortunately know, when you have a lot of flooding waters, it's not just the water that's the issue, but it's also all of the sediment that this water brings, right? You can see that this water is not clean. It's carrying a lot of stuff with it. And when the water recedes, all of that sediment is then left behind. So one thing that all of this increased meltwater has resulted in is actually a growing deltas in and along Greenland's coast. So deltas are these landforms that occur when a river reaches the ocean and drops all of the sediment that it's carrying. And what you're looking at here are some comparisons between 1985 on the left and then 2013 on the right. And the dashed lines that you're seeing here are the 1985 extents. So you can see that these deltas have actually grown. And this is a result of all of this additional water bringing more and more sediment out to the ocean and then dropping it all. This is an interesting, kind of from an ecological perspective, interesting change in ocean dynamics and ocean habitats. It's also interesting from more of a kind of geopolitical perspective as well, because the sand in deltas, delta sand is actually a very important global commodity that is scarce. And so there's a lot of discussion in Greenland about whether or not it makes sense to actually start trying to dredge and to trade this resource that is now kind of increasing in supply in Greenland, but is scarce around the rest of the world. Of course, that would have a lot of environmental consequences, but you can imagine for a group of people who are trying to gain financial independence, there might be some benefit to that kind of resource extraction. Those impacts are still directly related to melting ice. So the last thing I want to talk about for Greenland has to do with an impact of climate change that is connected to vegetation rather than to directly melting ice. So as I mentioned, this region is a kind of low-lying shrub tundra. You can see different shrubs around me here. There's birch and willow shrubs, and also a lot of grasses and other grass-like plants. And you can imagine that there are some things that are making it challenging, right, for these plants to grow in a polar environment. It's cold, the summer season is quite short. And the other thing that makes it challenging to grow here is the fact that there's permafrost below these plants. Permafrost is permanently frozen soil. And what that means is that the roots of these plants don't have much depth to grow into, which means that the plants themselves can't be very tall. So you can imagine that as the climate warms, you might have longer growing seasons. You might also have less permafrost, enabling these plants to grow deeper roots, grow taller, getting bigger, kind of more greenery, more biomass. And this is actually a trend that scientists are observing across the Arctic. So this is another map. Again, we're looking down on the North Pole here. And so across the Arctic here, everywhere where you see green is a place that over the last 4 decades has experienced a greening. So there's more vegetation that is growing each summer. And you might wonder, why do we really care about this? Maybe we just care if we live there, but the more plants that are growing in the Arctic, that represents a transfer of carbon from our atmosphere into that plant biomass through photosynthesis. So the more biomass there is, the more greening there is, that's carbon that isn't in our atmosphere continuing to warm our planet, but is being stored in the wood of shrubs or in the soil of these environments. However, you can also see that there are places that actually are colored brown on this map. These are places where there's this browning trend, where there isn't as much vegetation growing every summer. And this, when scientists started seeing this, it was a little puzzling, because you would think that maybe a warming climate, that sounds good for plants, right? Wouldn't they keep growing more? So what I want to show you now is a couple reasons why different places in the Arctic, and specifically this location of Kangerlussuaq, Greenland, might actually be trending towards kind of this browning condition rather than a greening one. And a browning condition in terms of this global climate, right, that's not as good in terms of mitigating the amount of CO2 that's in our atmosphere, right? If it's browning, it means that those plants are not taking in carbon. They might actually be emitting more carbon into the atmosphere. So one reason that some of these landscapes might be browning has to do with water availability. So what you're looking at here are some satellite images from going back to 1969 and up to 2017. And we're looking at a lake here, surface water, that over time has basically disappeared. Right? So a lot of lakes in this region have shrunk dramatically or have completely disappeared. And this can happen because of warming alone. So as the air is warmer, that's going to allow for more evaporation. So a lot of the surface water then just gets evaporated up into the atmosphere and rains down elsewhere. It can also happen because the permafrost thaws. So as that frozen ground starts to disappear, that then allows this water to drain and go elsewhere. So it's almost like we had this kind of concrete surface or something that was keeping all of this water up towards the surface, and that's where plants can access it. But then when you take that away, the water drains away from the surface and plants can't access it as much. So this is one reason why we may be seeing browning in some areas, because the plants, it's plenty warm, but they don't have enough water to grow. The other reason why we may be seeing browning in some places in the Arctic has to do with my own PhD research, which is connected to soil erosion, wind-driven soil erosion. So this photo is a kind of typical hillside in this region. You can see there are places that have shrubs and grasses, but there are also these locations that are pretty brown, right? They're very bare, not a lot of vegetation growing, and a lot of bare rocks are exposed. And this is a place where the wind has removed all of the topsoil, disturbed the vegetation, and you're just seeing kind of exposed soil and rocks. You can imagine that if this happened across the entire landscape, right, that would definitely explain why you might be seeing a browning trend. So when I first got to Greenland, this is kind of the topic that my PhD advisor gave me. And so I sat down and I did some field sketching, which is the best way I know to start kind of wrapping your mind around an interesting question or a science problem. And so this is the sketch that I first drew about this kind of soil erosion process. And I then spent many field seasons kind of documenting these locations where the soil erosion was happening, trying to understand what is the rate at which this is happening, how long has it been happening. And what I learned is that these are actually currently active. So they're currently expanding, although very slowly across the landscape. And so soil erosion is a possibility for why some regions in the Arctic are currently browning or may continue to brown into the future. So what I want you all to take away from this part of the talk on Greenland, first, hopefully, more of an appreciation of kind of the ecosystems and also the people of Greenland. And then also that there are these impacts of climate change that are not just about sea level rise, but also, connected to the vegetation and ecosystems of Greenland, and that this also has the potential to have a kind of a global impact as well through how it either draws down or can potentially emit more carbon into our atmosphere. Okay, we're gonna take a long journey now to the other side of the globe. I'm more than happy to answer questions about Greenland at the end, but for now I want to move on to talking about Antarctica. So Antarctica is another location, right, which is majority covered by ice. And in this case, there are actually kind of two different ice sheets that operate a little bit independently. There's the West Antarctic ice sheet and the East Antarctic ice sheet. West and East are a little bit strange to think about when you're pretty much at the South Pole, but this is what they're called. The West Antarctic ice sheet is kind of part of this Antarctic Peninsula, and if you go north from the Antarctic Peninsula, you get to South America, just to try to orient you. The East Antarctic ice sheet is much larger, and it is the vast majority of ice on the continent. The location I'm going to be talking about here is in this region here of the Ross Sea, where you see McMurdo. This is the largest US base on the continent. And north of McMurdo is Christchurch, New Zealand, and well, the rest of New Zealand as well, but Christchurch plays an important role. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we get here, what it's like to do some work there, and a little bit about my current project that I have going on. I do want to kind of set the stage again in terms of climate change, where Antarctica is a little bit different from the Arctic. The Arctic has already experienced quite a bit of warming, whereas the Antarctic ice sheets have not experienced quite as much melting yet. There has been some extreme melting and warming conditions, but those are mostly confined to the Antarctic Peninsula and the West Antarctic ice sheet. The East Antarctic ice sheet, on the other hand, has been quite stable, and a lot of Antarctica has not experienced a lot of warming yet. In the future, however, a lot of these kind of future trajectories, this figure is set up exactly like the other one that you saw. Most of these future trajectories, right, are still going downwards. We're predicting mass loss from both the East and West Antarctic ice sheets, contributing to sea level rise. But the warming that the Antarctic has already experienced has not been nearly as severe as the warming that the Arctic has already experienced. So this just makes this an interesting comparison. I'm going to be talking about a landscape that is very sensitive to change, but one that has not yet experienced a lot of warming. So in order to get to Antarctica to do work there, this was a lot of the work that I've done in Antarctica. I was based at Dartmouth, and so we flew to usually to LA. And then from LA, we flew to New Zealand, very long commercial flights. And in Christchurch, New Zealand, we're outfitted with extreme cold weather gear. So including these very fashionable big red parkas and white bunny boots that we're actually required to wear at many times during our travels. And then we fly onwards to Antarctica. And this flight is unlike any kind of commercial flight that I've ever experienced before. It is on a military flight. This is on an LC-130 plane, and you can actually see the ski here, that the plane actually lands on ice. And so it has skis that come down. And this flight is pretty uncomfortable, 8 hours of very loud noise, uncomfortable seats, and a lot of excitement because you're getting closer to Antarctica. When we land, we are transported to McMurdo, which, as I mentioned, this is the largest US base on the Antarctic continent. This is what it looks like from a helicopter. Or actually, I think I'm up on a mountain here. Anyway, this is what it looks like. During the summer season, so during the austral summer, so around in January, there can be more than 1,000 people who are living and working here. And everything at this base, as well as the rest of the Antarctic continent, it is all for, everything is in support of science. So although I'm using some military language, we refer to it as a base, it is all peaceful work and all in support of science. McMurdo itself is located on the Ross Island. So that is an island here, and McMurdo is right on the tip, the point of this island here. Where I have done my research is on the mainland of Antarctica in the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And these are valleys kind of over here on the Antarctic continent. So in order to get there, we have to fly in a helicopter. And this is probably one of the most amazing experiences and parts of doing research here. So we take a helicopter. This is my colleague Jess, looking very excited about taking off from McMurdo. And we're flying over the McMurdo Sound. So between the island onto the mainland. And so we get to pass over this amazing marine environment that is just a beautiful landscape, has amazing sea ice, and has just incredible wildlife like these Adelie penguins. And also orca whales that we get to see. So this is just an amazing experience, kind of flying across. And ultimately, our destination is the McMurdo Dry Valleys. This is Taylor Valley here. And the Dry Valleys, again, I'm talking about part of the polar regions that's a desert, right? So this is another very dry landscape where wind plays a really important role, and there's actually not a lot of water at all. What I love about this satellite image is that you can see a lot of the different pieces of this landscape that I'll be talking about. There are glaciers. Here are some glaciers that are flowing down into the valley. There are also lakes in this valley. Here is one lake, and these lakes are perennially covered with ice. So there's ice on the surface that never melts. Just some water around the edges melts every year. You can also see these kind of white traces, faint white lines. These are outlining stream channels, and these streams flow from 4 to 6 weeks out of the year. Whenever there is enough solar radiation to melt the glaciers, this meltwater then travels in these streams into these lakes. And they're traveling across kind of the vast majority of the valley is this bare, exposed soil. It's very rocky, kind of looks like a moonscape. Not exactly like fertile soil that you would want to grow a garden in, but hopefully I will convince you that it's a soil that we should definitely care about. So this is what it looks like on the ground as well. Now we're kind of we're standing on this soil, this dry, rocky landscape. We're looking at one of the lakes here with a moat that has formed. So again, this is water that is melted out because it's the summer. And then here in the distance is one of these glaciers that comes down into the valley. Here's one of the streams that flows, bringing glacial meltwater into one of the lakes, cutting across this very dry landscape. And so far in all of these photos, you may be scratching your head and thinking, there's like no life here. Why would anyone think that, you know, there's no ecology to actually do any research about here? But what's amazing about this landscape is that there is actually life everywhere that you look. So one of the most kind of clear places where there is life is along the margins of the streams. So all of this dark material that you see right along the edge of the stream here, this is a rich, diverse microbial mat. So it's an assemblage of microorganisms, algae, diatoms that can respond pretty much immediately to liquid water, take advantage of this very short growing season, and then kind of go back into this dormant state over the very long, cold, dark winter. There's also life kind of everywhere else that you look. You can flip over a rock, and this green coating that looks like it's almost part of the rock is actually some algae that is growing underneath the rock. So again, like a really amazing, incredible adaptation to this very harsh landscape. There is moss. There are no vascular plants here, right? So nothing that can kind of grow tall, but there are kind of pockets of moss. This is probably the greenest part of the landscape here. And then if you look closer into the soil, there's a whole diverse microbial community and you know, all these different worms and a whole food web that you can see in the soil if you look close enough. You're looking here at a nematode. This is a small worm, and there are nematodes that are only found in this part of Antarctica. There are also nematodes that are found kind of all across the different polar regions that are found here as well. So all of this life, you know, this landscape that looks really kind of barren is actually teeming with life everywhere. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this landscape is the fact that wind plays such an important role here. So the project that I'm currently working on in the McMurdo Dry Valleys has to do with wind transported material. So this is kind of a conceptual framework of our project. We are studying dust that blows up onto the surface of these glaciers. And again, the glacier surfaces, you might not think that there's life up there, but there actually is life that lives on top of the glacier. And, you know, all of this microbial life, just like us, we need nutrients. Where do those nutrients come from? They can actually come from this dust that gets deposited on the top of the glacier surface. When the dust gets deposited up on here, it starts melting its way down into the ice. And as it does that, it is interacting with liquid water. And that liquid water can start eating away at these tiny particles of rock and release nutrients that then are critical for this microbial life to thrive. So this dust can actually kind of fertilize some of the growth of these microbial communities that can happen both on the surface of the glacier and also downstream in the streams. So we're working with a lot of very dusty kind of snow and ice samples that we collected across the landscape. So you can see just how much this is a snowbank here where it does not look white, right? Because all of this dust has been blown up onto the snowbank. In this environment, you can imagine there isn't a lot to block the wind, and the wind can get very, very extreme in these very cold environments. And so there's a lot of potential for dust to be blown around. When we collect these samples, we're then interested in taking a very, very close look at these individual grains of dust. So we filter out all of the grains of dust, and then we can isolate individual ones and put them onto this tiny little disc here. And this disk then goes into a scanning electron microscope that allows us to look up in incredible detail at these grains of dust. And that allows us to see how much they have been weathered, how much they've been eaten away, and how much of these nutrients have been released into the ecosystem. So I just want to show you a few of these images because I think they're pretty mind-boggling. These are now images taken through this scanning electron microscope, and I want to give you a sense of scale. So this scale bar here is 30 microns across, and one kind of strand of hair is about 70 microns. So this is very small. It's probably right along the kind of edge of what we can see with a naked eye. And some of these grains of dust look like kind of beautiful intact crystals, right? This is just like it just popped out of a rock and nothing has happened to it. Some of these grains, however, look really kind of beaten up, eaten away. So all of these on the right here, all of the linear kind of indentations that you're seeing are places where these grains have been eaten away and have then released nutrients out into the environment. You can think of this basically like cavities forming on like in your teeth, right? If you are drinking really acidic soda, that's going to eat away at your teeth are going to be dissolving, releasing things. And the same thing is happening to these grains of dust. And these patterns are just really amazing to look at. Again, look at these scale bars. This is just 10 microns. So the 10th, almost like a 10th or a 7th of the width of one strand of hair is what you're seeing across here. And all of these features just can look almost like pieces of artwork. The detail that you can see and how these grains are being eaten away. You can also see lots of signs of life up here as well. So dust is not just made up of rock, but you can also see fragments of life up here as well. On the left, you're seeing a diatom. So diatoms are single-celled algae that make their cell walls out of silica and form these really intricate, amazing structures. And you're seeing one on the left there. And then on the right, you're seeing a piece of microbial mat. So just that black material that I showed you along the side of a stream, that can get broken up and also blown up on the glaciers. We know this is biological, not only because of the composition, but also if you take a look, there's this kind of like donut shape here. It looks almost like this perfect round circle. Whenever you see something that is that round, it is likely a cell, definitely a sign of life. So we are really zoomed in now, thinking about all of the things that are happening to these individual particles. But I want to just kind of end on a broader note and thinking about how, this landscape is one that is very sensitive to change, and it's very sensitive to the balance between liquid water and frozen ice. You can imagine that all of these microscopic processes that I was talking about, right, all of these grains of dust, this is all in this kind of intricate balance right now. And you can imagine that if there's just a little bit more liquid water, or if there's just a little bit more or less wind blowing the dust up onto the glaciers, that's going to then change all of these intricate connections that are part of this amazing ecosystem. And that's going to have a lot of consequences for this environment that is really a pretty special, unique place on Earth. So while this environment has not yet experienced a lot of warming and change, it's one that is definitely sensitive to change. And when warming does come to this environment, which it is projected to warm, there will definitely be a lot of consequences for this environment. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank you all for your attention. And I would love to take whatever questions you have. Those can be questions about just the science or what it's like to do work in these places. I'm happy to talk about anything.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I feel like I've been to both places tonight. So if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat or the question and answer. You can get those at the bottom. So while folks are queuing that up, maybe I'll launch one question to give folks a minute to find the chat and the question and answer. You talked about the Arctic warming faster than the rest of the globe, and yet the Antarctic not warming as fast. And I'm curious why that is.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I will start with some thoughts about why in general, the polar regions might be more sensitive to warming. And then maybe try to address why the Antarctic hasn't experienced that quite as much. But first, in general, we can think of the polar regions as being kind of like a ice pack for the planet. So the fact that there's so much ice there means that a lot of incoming energy from the sun is getting reflected off of the ice. And this actually keeps the polar regions even colder than they would be just based on kind of the angle of the sun. But when all of that ice starts to melt, you can get into this kind of positive feedback where the lack of ice then allows even more energy from the sun to get absorbed by darker surfaces like water or vegetation. And you can speed up this warming process that doesn't happen for the rest of the planet. And so this is referred to as the ice albedo feedback. And it's a main reason why scientists think the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet. Why that isn't happening in the Antarctic is a little bit more tricky, I think. And my understanding for that has a bit more to do with the geography of the Antarctic, where the Antarctic is this one continent that is surrounded by an ocean. And what that means is that Antarctica is kind of isolated from the rest of the planet, both in terms of ocean currents and also from air currents. So there's this very strong kind of winds that are going around Antarctica, and that can lead Antarctica to be a very different climate from the rest of the globe and doesn't allow some of the warming that the rest of the planet has experienced to kind of penetrate to the Antarctic. One thing I've heard people say is that one of the reasons potentially that the Antarctic Peninsula is warming really fast is that it's like this thumb that's sticking out of this like polar vortex. And so it is actually more connected to the rest of the globe than the majority of the continent.
Thanks. Let's stay in Antarctica for a minute. Someone is wondering what the temperature during the day is there in Antarctica.
Yeah, great question. So when I am there, I traveled there basically during the height of austral summer, so in January, and the temperatures were usually hovering right around freezing. So kind of in the upper 20s, low 30s. The soil can definitely get a bit warmer than that because it's absorbing a lot of solar energy from the sun, and there is enough, it's warm enough for melt to be generated, but it's right around that freezing temperature. So in January, when I'm there, it is usually colder in Vermont than it is in Antarctica, but you have to remember that Vermont is in winter and Antarctica is in summer at that point.
Thanks. Deborah has a question, and Deborah, I'm going to try to make it so that you can ask your question out loud. So if you unmute yourself, I think you should be able to do that. Yep, you did that. So let's try talking. I think we should be able to hear you.
Well, my question was the temperature one, so it already got answered.
Oh, well, great. Thanks for putting it in both places.
Unless there's another Deborah out there.
No, thanks. Thanks for that question. That was a good one. Another question that I have that is also I guess climate change related is back to Greenland, actually. You mentioned that the soil erosion is increasing. Is that increase driven by climate change in some way? What is the link there?
Yeah, I think that is a good question that may not have a total complete answer yet. Trying to understand, the soil erosion definitely is active. Whether or not it is kind of rapidly increasing or not, I think is an open question. And the connection to warming, I think, may be one that is also connected to the water availability again, because you could imagine that a landscape that is has a lot of surface water, is very moist and wet, could be better at resisting wind erosion, but soil that's very dry could more easily get eroded. And so in these parts of the Arctic that are very dry, if they keep on getting drier and drier, that then makes them more susceptible to this kind of wind-driven erosion. So I think the connection there is not necessarily directly a climate change one. Wind might not be changing quickly enough to increase the erosion, but if the soil is getting drier, then that could leave it more susceptible to erosion.
We had a question about dust, but really about you. What inspired you to study dust?
Oh, that is a good question. I think in some way it's kind of like you get drawn to something that seems a little bit unusual, or something that, I had never really thought about dust being this really important part of our climate system. It's not something that we tend to learn about, at least in a lot of our, typical education. You don't spend a lot of time talking about dust. And so this idea that something that's almost invisible to us can then have so much, can be such a kind of important driving force, I think, is something that I really, yeah, I like that kind of puzzle.
That's great. Thanks. I'm going to read this one. Emily writes, "Thank you, Ruth. This is all so fascinating. I'm curious what your research found in both regions that speaks to the acceleration of ice melt. For instance, as the melt speeds up, how will this affect species populations, habitat, inability to migrate and or adapt? And how will the human populations that depend on marine life and plant matter for food be able to adapt or not?"
Wow, okay, there's a lot in there. And I'm not, so this seems like a question that's maybe a little bit more about Greenland, thinking about this acceleration that we are kind of already seeing in terms of melting. And in terms of wildlife that is directly connected to humans in Greenland, I would say probably the most important thing to consider there is the caribou, because that is something that is hunted a lot and relied on by lots of Greenlanders. And in terms of the caribou, kind of the acceleration of warming and ice melt, and there's a connection with vegetation here as well, because we can think about a lot of this warming as one of the biggest impacts is kind of throwing off the timing of a lot of things. So as warming occurs, you know, we know this from, you can think about this, you know, in our own backyards, right? This spring, or I don't even know what season it is right now, right? All of a sudden, like, we have flowers that are coming up. There are snowdrops that are flowering outside of my window, and it's February. And so all of this warming has changed the timing of when things occur. But some things like these flowers are responding very quickly to a warmer spring. And so they're going to come up in response to that warmer spring. But some things like caribou, and when caribou calve, that does not respond as quickly. And that's not going to respond, it might not actually ever respond to a warming climate. That's just more built into the amount of daylight that caribou experience. And so this can throw off the timing of when caribou calves are born, what is the vegetation that they're able to eat. And that can definitely impact the population of caribou, how they are migrating, and then of course how the local communities in Greenland are able to hunt them. So that's just one example of an example of how accelerating warming could influence wildlife that humans rely on.
We've got actually two other questions about people, the people of Greenland here. So the first one is about whether the people of Greenland are receptive to your research there.
Yeah. So one of the amazing things about being part of this program at Dartmouth was that we were able to connect with folks in Greenland, and we put a lot more of our kind of time and energy in meeting with folks in Greenland than many other scientists do. So I think there is definitely kind of a big issue with scientists kind of flying into Greenland, doing research, and then leaving, right? It's another kind of form of extraction where you're getting this information, you're leaving with it, and you're not necessarily communicating that to folks in Greenland or involving Greenlanders in research as well. And so one of the benefits of this program was that we met a lot of folks in Greenland. There was a exchange kind of program where we were able to meet folks at the university in Greenland, in Nuuk, and then students also came to Dartmouth. And so we had conversations with people at the university in Greenland about some of our research, and also with the town of Kangerlussuaq where we were. And in general, people were definitely very receptive and kind of interested in what we were doing. I think in general, a lot of folks in Greenland are quite concerned about kind of geopolitical issues in terms of, for instance, trying to get independence from Denmark, and climate change is maybe not the top of their mind, or it, you know, there are communities definitely that are struggling with trying to adapt to changing ice conditions. But just like here in the US, where there's a whole range of interest and focus on climate change, the same is true in Greenland as well, really depending on what folks do for a living and, you know, how they have kind of connected to kind of different ecological or environmental issues in the past. So there are definitely a lot of folks who are very concerned about climate change and very receptive to our research, but also folks who, you know, don't necessarily spend much time thinking about that.
Well, I'll insert a question here and an opportunity for just for you to tell folks about the JSEP program, because that seems like a great example of this.
Yeah, definitely. So there is a program that I have been involved with that brings together high school students from the US, from Denmark, and from Greenland as part of a field school. And so all of the students who went to Greenland as part of my program were involved in teaching that program. And so this was an amazing opportunity for students from those three countries to get to know each other culturally a bit, and also to learn about Greenland and about climate change. And they spent some time in Kangarooswalk and then also some time up on the ice sheet. And I think especially for the Greenlandic students getting to travel up onto the ice sheet, you know, they've spent their entire life living close to it, but haven't, you know, it's hard to get on the top of the Greenland ice sheet. And so for them to be able to travel up there and to just kind of see what the Greenland ice sheet was like at the summit was pretty, a really meaningful experience for them. Yeah.
Thanks for that addition. And then sticking with the people of Greenland, there's a question about whether there's a link between increasing ice melt and public health of folks living in Greenland.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, and definitely, and in probably many more ways than I can even think of right now. So, you know, there are a lot of public health links in terms of, well, a clear public health link in terms of where folks are getting food from. So, you know, if you think about Greenlanders eat a lot of marine food, so lots of fishing, and as the ice melts, that is really changing the population of different animals, and definitely going to be changing their diet, and also changing how they're able to do that fishing. So that's kind of a direct diet. There's definitely direct diet link. And, you know, then there are also other environmental issues of, you know, increased ice melt can also mean different pollutants are traveling in different ways up into the Arctic. And sometimes there can be actually a kind of concentration of pollutants in the Arctic and in Arctic mammals that Greenlanders are eating a lot of. And then I think, you know, another thing that comes to my mind, and again, there are like probably a lot of different connections that you could make here, but, you know, as the ice melts and as the Arctic opens up, this also potentially opens the door for more development. So for more tourism, for more shipping, for more kind of resource extraction. There's already interest from Chinese companies of mining in Greenland. And so that can also for sure have public health consequences.
We're going to go back to dust now. What do you think is the most important fact about dust?
Ooh. That is a good question. Most important fact about dust. One that tends to blow people's minds is the fact that it may be the case, and scientists have shown a connection between dust from the Sahara and the productivity of the Amazon rainforest. So not in the Arctic at all, but it is just a dust fact that I think is pretty amazing, that Saharan dust that is blown across the ocean can then land in the in the Amazon rainforest and deliver really important nutrients like phosphorus and iron that then can allow this like amazingly biodiverse rainforest.
And Peter is also wondering about dust. Can you imagine any global situation where enough dust gets into the atmosphere, maybe through volcanoes, that could help reduce climate change?
Yeah, so it is definitely true that when you have a lot of dust in the atmosphere, right, that can reflect incoming solar radiation and then potentially lower the global temperature. It is hard to imagine a case where that would happen in a really sustained way. Something like a volcanic eruption is going to have a short window when it does decrease the temperature, but then all of that dust kind of falls out, and the lasting impact of volcanoes tends to be warming because of the CO2 that is released. So other sources of dust, you know, again, could contribute. One thing that's actually kind of interesting is that as cities have increased air quality, that means reducing the amount of dust that they emit into the atmosphere. We can actually see this kind of intensification of warming because the dust hasn't been like counteracting it as much. So it's this interesting, you definitely want better air quality, right? We don't want to be breathing in these particles, but it is true that they can kind of shield from a little bit of warming at least.
But interesting to think, at least in the case of the volcanoes, about the difference in the immediate
Yes.
impact versus the long-term impact.
Yes. Yeah.
We have someone who's wondering how you get up on the ice sheet.
Yeah, another good question. So the same plane that I showed you that transports us to Antarctica actually flies us up to the Greenland ice sheet. So we take this military plane that leaves a kind of normal airport in Greenland on the coast, takes off on wheels, and then lowers the skis down. And then there is an ice runway where basically they have groomed a runway on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet. And that plane then lands on the skis. And yeah, that is about I think about a 4-hour flight from the coast, or maybe it's 2 to 4 hours. I can't remember exactly, but it's a much shorter than going to Antarctica, going from the coast of Greenland up onto the summit.
Wow, thanks. And then we have another sort of, I guess, a geopolitical question from Ron, who says, "Thank you, Ruth. How is your and your colleagues' research results being forwarded to the proper governmental departments worldwide to facilitate positive changes in the climate approach?"
That is a good question. I would say that at this point, I maybe am not doing as much as I could to make sure that that is communicated. You know, our general outlets are scientific publications, but what I do know and feel at least like the program at Dartmouth has contributed to a lot of my colleagues in that program went on to positions in the government where they are working in kind of science and technology offices and in this kind of bridge between science and policy. And they are, I know, doing a really important job of, you know, they are scientists by training, and so they know a lot of this work that is coming out, and then they are advocating it advocating for science-driven policy at the government level. So, I think it requires those people who work in that kind of bridge position to really make that process happen. And of course, I don't think it is happening as much as it could or should be. But I think the more people who go into science fields, but then know that there are these kind of policy routes for their careers, I think that is really important.
At least from my onlooker's perspective, that seemed like a really important aspect of that Dartmouth PhD program, was how interdisciplinary it was and the different fields that your fellow colleagues, students went into. Thank you. We've just got a couple last comments here. Thanking you for the presentation, and Emily noting that it looks like a Planet Earth episode was talking about the dust transfer from the Sahara to the Amazon. So she writes, a reason to protect forest ecosystems too, as it affects life in the Arctic and Antarctic. Perhaps a good note to end on that, those global connections of what you've talked about at both poles.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so much for your time tonight, and for joining us. And thank you all for joining. I really appreciate you traveling with us tonight to the poles. And a reminder, we have 3 more naturalist journeys yet this winter. All are going to be both in person and virtual, so they're all hybrid presentations. And if you want to check them out afterwards, they're recorded and posted on our website. So thank you all. Have a good evening. Thanks again.